Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we completed the Swamp Palace, where we obtained the hookshot. So continuing on with the Dungeons of the Dark World, we're heading into Skull Woods next, which we can now reach using the hookshot to cross the river here, and following the path to the northwest corner of the map. Usually at this point, we talk about a handful of pre-dungeon things to do, but there isn't much to talk about in this case. You can do some side quests if you feel so inclined to, but there is absolutely nothing preventing you from heading straight into the dungeon from here. In fact, the hookshot isn't even the only way to reach this portion of the map, since there's a nearby portal accessible with the hammer that we got back in the Palace of Darkness. I do want to mention though, that if you're at this point of the game and you haven't upgraded your magic meter yet, I really do recommend it before this dungeon. It's not mandatory to do so, but it is very helpful. So yeah, we just have to get to this section of the map and enter the woods themselves, which are, in a way, an extension of the dungeon. We'll get more into that in a moment, but within these woods we'll find several entrances through which we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to Skull Woods, which is the name of both this dungeon and the surrounding area outside. That may at first sound confusing, but this dungeon's overall structure actively works to blur the lines between dungeon and overworld. It achieves this by having multiple entrances and exits, requiring us to weave in and out of the dungeon and overworld in order to navigate the dungeon successfully. And that's the main focus of this dungeon. The larger puzzle box aspect here is simply navigating the dungeon itself, which is made challenging by the numerous one-way paths, the placement of keys being spread out from their respective locked doors, mostly, and the structure having several disconnected sections. This disjointed, segmented structure really makes this dungeon stand out. I think if every dungeon took this approach, it wouldn't be so interesting, but this is a really unique spin on the typical navigational formula that is really only found here, especially because it means that depending on where you choose to enter the dungeon, you may explore these rooms in an entirely different order from playthrough to playthrough. Myself, I tend to usually start the dungeon by either walking through this entrance or falling down this pit into this easternmost room. Based on the entrance placement outside, this feels to me like the general area that they want you to first enter, so that they can tease you with the big treasure chest out of reach here, which contains the dungeon item. Therefore, for the sake of making this video less confusing, we'll call this chunk of the dungeon Section 1. The map is also found nearby in that eastern room, so we can get a general sense of the overall layout before exploring even more. However, we'll quickly run into a lot of locked doors and no keys. In short, we can't get anywhere in Section 1 here aside from getting the map. It's all just teases or the promise of more explorable space, prompting us to explore outside and find another entrance. That will bring us to what I'll call Section 2, where we'll find both the big key as well as this small key, which we can in turn take back and use in Section 1. The payoff for all of that effort is the Fire Rod, which is a lovely dungeon item. It launches fireballs at the cost of magic power and is used really nicely here. I mentioned this with both the hammer and hookshot before, but I'll reiterate my point here. The reason this works so well as a dungeon item for me is that it essentially unlocks the last section of the dungeon and is used for puzzles, and by extension for progression, and it makes tough enemies which we've already encountered throughout the dungeon much easier to defeat. In particular, these Gibdos and Wallmasters, but also Bari can be killed in a single hit with it and won't split into the smaller Biri, making these enemies that were previously either a serious threat or at least a bit irritating, suddenly very easy to dispatch. That alone brings an inherent sense of satisfaction to getting and using this item, and makes us as the player feel like we've grown more powerful. It's just too bad that the fire rod doesn't work on these hard hat beetles, because I hate these guys with a burning passion. But hey, at least you can use the hookshot to knock them into these abysses. Bye! So as mentioned, there is a third section to the dungeon, which is unlocked using the fire rod. Section 3 falls back on the game's old habits though. The navigational element somewhat tapers off at this point, whereas section 1 and 2 are winding labyrinths with lots of interconnected rooms. Section 3 is a linear gauntlet approaching the boss fight. That's not a bad thing, and honestly, this dungeon structure has legitimately never bothered me. In fact, I never even really noticed that so many of this game's dungeons do this until I started making these videos. But it was admittedly rather refreshing when the last dungeon didn't do that and kept something of a puzzle element in the final section's navigation. That said, this dungeon structure already up until this point has been enough of a shakeup that a bit of familiarity in the progression structure works alright here in this final act. Section 3 is made up of 7 rooms with only a single detour, briefly having to duck into this hallway to get this key before heading towards the boss, whereas Section 1 and 2 relied on its twisting sense of navigation as a larger puzzle. This section throws at us room-to-room challenges, such as groups of enemies and a couple of smaller puzzles, including this one with arguably too many floor tiles, a nice torch lighting puzzle making good use of the fire rod, and the door itself being obscured by vines in this room, not unlike the curtains blocking the path to Aghanim back in Hyrule Castle. Overall, this final section works well for me, as these individual challenges are well crafted enough, and we're going to get a lot of use out of that fire rod. More importantly though, these two styles work well together. A larger unraveling tangled knot section that we have to explore thoroughly, spread out between 2 isolated sections, requiring us to keep in mind the dungeon as a larger whole, and then a more focused gauntlet that tests us with individual rooms. It strikes a lovely balance that way. With all of that said, once we've burned our way past these Gibdos and made it to the northernmost rooms of the dungeon, we can drop down this pit and confront the dungeon boss. Landing in the arena, we'll immediately come face to face with Mothula. Clearly an homage to Mothra, but alright, they're a big moth and not a giant eyeball. Wow. Mothula itself isn't so hard. They'll fly around launching these projectile attacks at you, the angle and spread of which makes them pretty easy to avoid, and if you're aggressive enough, you can deplete their health fairly quickly. Nah, Mothula isn't that tough at all. It's the room they're battled in that's the real challenge. This arena is chaotic, even bullet hellish. First off, we have the treadmill floors, which frequently changes direction, meaning you have to put extra effort into your positioning. In addition to that, we got blade traps, 34 of them, and they do start sliding around as they're known to do, but in pretty unpredictable ways. This adds a frenetic element to the fight that makes what would otherwise be a pushover of a boss a genuine challenge. If it were either the blade traps or the moving floor, I don't think it would be so difficult, but the combination is deadly. I've played this game countless times over the years, and I still have to load up on fairies in preparation for this fight, and yes, I do tend to burn through them still. While your sword does work, I find the fire rod to be extremely helpful in this fight, much the same as the bow was for the Armos Knights Palace, way back in the Eastern Palace, since it allows you to keep your distance, fire off a shot at the boss, and focus on avoiding the blade traps. But even still, this is going to drain your magic meter, so either pack a potion or be prepared to fall back on your sword. The fight overall is pretty quick, but it feels like the difficulty curve is pretty steep pretty suddenly here. The other bosses have been a gradual build-up in terms of difficulty, but this Mothula fight is a spike on that difficulty curve that I don't think any of the other bosses really match. I don't mind a good challenge. I think I've outlined that many times, but this one doesn't quite feel earned to me. Ah well. Once they're defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual. The next maiden is freed and offers us a chunk of exposition, and we're off to explore the Dark World some more. So that's the dungeon. I like Skull Woods conceptually, and it is pretty fun to navigate overall, but it isn't without its flaws either. That navigational aspect in the first two sections really is stellar though. The dungeon makes great use of these floor tile puzzles, which were introduced in the Tower of Hera, and they're used well here, even affecting other rooms, adding to that larger navigational puzzle, since some areas will initially be inaccessible until those floor tiles get activated in another room. In particular, this is used well for the item chest. Just reaching that thing is a puzzle itself, but it does feel like there is some squandered potential for this in other areas, such as this locked door in the western portion of section 2, since the next room is pointless. I hate this room. Why do you exist? In fact, this is a bit of an issue with this dungeon overall. There's a number of rooms that are meaningless to the overall progression and only seem to be there to trip you up. This wouldn't bother me if it weren't for the fact that we have to spend keys to open them up. In terms of navigation, what point is there to finding this key which unlocks this door if it just takes us back into a room that we've already combed through? It doesn't bridge section 1 and 2 or act as a shortcut or loop in the path back from anything meaningful. I don't think I'd mind this as much if the door we entered this room through didn't seal behind us, but it does, and since there is no meaningful item or treasure found here, it feels like my time is being wasted. That aforementioned pointless room especially annoys me though. There is nothing worthwhile found here, and we have to spend a key to get in here. It makes it feel like I'm being penalized for exploring thoroughly, which is typically the opposite of what Zelda games do. I think these issues would be less irritating if we weren't having to avoid wall masters constantly. In a room or two, these guys aren't so bad, but they're in almost every single room of this dungeon, and they can be frankly annoying. The fire rod somewhat alleviates that, but even still, you can be snatched by them if you aren't on your toes, and it's just a nuisance. One final complaint, I mentioned that this room might have an excess of these floor tile switches, and I don't think that would be a bad thing at all, especially from a puzzle point of view, if they didn't play the secret jingle every single time you touched one. This room almost single-handedly makes one of the most iconic sounds in the series kind of irritating. Yet, despite all of those issues, I often look back on this dungeon and call it one of my favorites in the game. I don't think it's quite as well designed as, say, the previous two dungeons, but when I'm exploring these first two sections, there's a genuine joy to having that aha moment as you pick apart the tangled knot of rooms. The dungeon demands that you explore and get acquainted with its layout, and I love that. A glance at the map would imply that this is a tall order, since the dungeon seems to lack a memorable central room, like what the Swamp Palace had. But because of the way that the overworld and dungeon are blended together like this, I would argue that the woods above serve that role, acting as a central room that the entirety of the dungeon is connected to. Between that and the rooms having memorable layouts and landmarks, navigation remains engaging and interesting, which is important since it rests at the core of how the dungeon plays. So combine that lovely exploration with how much fun it is to light your enemies on fire, and overall you have a very enjoyable dungeon. While this playthrough may have bumped this one down my own dungeon ranking, despite all of its flaws, I still like this place a lot. thank you all so much for watching. Before we end this off, I just wanted to say thank you to the lovely people who supported me on Patreon or here on YouTube as a channel member, including but not limited to Grey Mage, Brenda, Tetra, Callie, Hylian West, Justin, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny. Thank you all so much for the support and for watching, and I will catch you all next time. Bye-bye.